Good morning and welcome to Behind the Screen. I am JM, your host. This is the Iconic Production channel, and this is a show where we just kind of step behind the screen. I talk about game design, I talk about world design, I talk about influences, board games, role-playing games, just all things gaming. Just from my point of view, and engage with the chat and see who's out there and who's listening, and just have a good time talking about games and game design. So this morning we are finishing up our look at the Lukoraji, a new creature for a Jackals campaign that I'm running, and a creature that I will post on my blog probably later today or later this week, hopefully, for any Jackals lore master to use. And so we're just going to jump right into it. I've got my coffee this morning. It's a really good latte from a local coffee shop. If you are ever in the area of Dallas, look up Billy Joe's Coffee. This is a whiskey morning latte, and he does his own syrups, and it's wonderful. All right. So, when we last left off, we were finishing out the Lukoraji stats. And hey, Becca, good to see you this morning. Becca, you'll probably get to fight this thing at some point. Yay! Padre, good to see you as well. And yeah, you should totally use these for. Becca will be running a game at Petrie's Family Games in Colorado Springs. So if you guys want to, if you're in the area and need some more Jackals in your life, you should go check out Becca's game in Colorado Springs. So good morning to you, Padre, as well. I'm not sure if I said that already. I have not had a lot of this coffee yet. So let's kind of go over the stats as we had them last time and some changes that I made. So we had their defense at 100, and one of the things is I called out that their morale is only 65. The reason I did that is because while they are intelligent and while they are vicious, they are not necessarily going to fight to the death, which basically a 100 would mean they only had a 10% chance of ever running away from a fight. And so these are creatures who are intelligent. They have human intelligence, but they are also unaging, but know that they can face death. So I really wanted to make sure that there was a chance that they would run away and come back at a later point. I also finished out their special abilities because I said I was going to do that. And so what we have here is I tweaked Curse Flesh. So the Lukoraji are immune to non-magical bronze weapon. They negate all damage, but not the damage bonus from non-magical bronze weapons. We kind of talked about that last time, right? They can't take... let me move this so you can see it a little bit better. You can crush them to death, but it would take a long time. However, they are also... unaging, so they're essentially immortal. And the reason that's important is once the curse takes hold, and I may write an adventure about trying to stop the curse from taking hold, but once the curse takes hold, they are essentially trapped within the flesh of the wolf. And so they become immortal, and therefore, because they cannot die, they are locked into their choice. And so this is sort of kind of harkening back to sort of some of the older theological debates between, right, angelic beings, can they be redeemed? What is the purpose of death? This all kind of is being fed into here in the Lukoraji myth. Now they're going to have consumption abilities, much like the Kashaptu that we used. And so essentially the idea here is that as they inflict wounds, they grow more powerful. So they start, if they've inflicted no damage this season, this is essentially where they start at. And as they inflict wounds, as they eat more of the Jackal's flesh, they start getting more and more powerful. And the idea here, and I didn't put this in here, so this is a good time to start in here, is that at the end, each season, the Lukoraji consumption score drops by 1 tier. put an example in there. Well, I'll put an example in there when I write up. So essentially, at the end of the season, they kind of drop down. If they're at 38, they would drop down to 21 consumption points. And if the jackals don't encounter them again, they're probably going to drop down to 11 the next season, as the hunger just sort of continues to consume them and reduce them back down to base. Now, I did say they take double damage from weapons of iron. Iron is Eraton's sky metal that he sends down to Melkone to aid them against certain magical creatures. It's very rare in Melkone, right? It's essentially meteoric in the Melkone region. And so they take double damage from iron. It ignores their cursed flesh abilities. It just rips through them. And because they start with a defense of 100, the Lukoraji all begin the game with one of the following talents up to the GM. So I tried to make it nice and simple for LMs to be able to use these going forward. And then I updated the combat rages from the wolves. Essentially, they work between 1 and 50, the same way wolves do. So they can snap for a little bit more damage than a wolf. If it does damage, they can basically pop free and dart away. 16 to 35 is a hamstring. Again, a little bit more damage than the base wolf. And if you fail your endurance check, you lose 2 clash points and half your move until a successful healing check is made upon you, because essentially they just tear out a chunk of your leg. 36 to 50, still darting maul, which is basically claw, bite. And they can move between each attack. If both claw attacks hit the same target, they knock their opponent prone, gaining a bonus against them. But then I figured we'd design, so we had something to design this morning. We'd look at their 51 to 70, which is they have base combat through 70, and then 71 to 90, as they start consuming flesh, they start getting a little bit more potent. So kind of what I wanted to do here is with this Savage Rend, I wanted a double attack that if they both hit, something bad would happen. Rook, good to see you, buddy. I love that emote. That's fantastic. Hopefully you guys are all seeing that on the screen. So let's make this a pretty potent attack. So my thought here is we're going to start off with 2d10 base damage. And 2d10 is, sorry for the jumping around, is 11 base damage. And it's 2 attacks. And we'll say that if both attacks hit the same target, and that's kind of my thought, like, what should be the follow-up here? I don't want to necessarily knock them prone again. And I want something that kind of feeds into, no pun intended, this idea of the consumptive hunger. And so I'm thinking that if both... Well, do we just make it knock prone again and let the Lukoraji make an additional attack, a third attack? Well, so I was thinking about that, Rook. I'm glad you brought that up. So as I've been pondering the mythology of the Lukoraji, I think I'm going to steer away from the infectious nature of the werewolf lore. This is definitely a curse that falls upon creatures and not necessarily a infection of the flesh or the spirit. Unless, of course, we wanted to say, maybe it is an infection. Not an infection of the curse, but just the fact that the wolves they're so they eat human flesh, and that breeds diseases in their mouth. We could create a disease, a specific disease that can encounter. All right. So let's do this. Both attacks hit. The target must make a difficult endurance check or contract. Oh. All right, so let me switch these up. Because Becca and Rook have got some interesting ideas. Yes, it does, Padre. The act of becoming a Lukoraji involves an active choice of consuming human flesh. But Becca and Rook just came up with some interesting ideas. So let's do it this way. Tearing Jaws. We're going to make this their big attack here. So we're going to make this a 3d10 attack, which would do, 15, 16 points of damage on the average. And ignores up to 2 pro. The target missing a difficult endurance check or contract. Let's call it Red Maw Fever. And we'll develop Red Maw Fever later. And then we'll have, if both attacks hit the same target, the target must make a difficult, let's make it a willpower check, or gain 1d8 corruption, double on a fumble. So essentially, the Savage Wren will hit, and if it both hit the same target, the target makes a difficult willpower check or gains a d8 corruption, which is actually a lot of corruption. So let me dial that back. Let's say a d6 corruption. Tearing Jaws, if it hits, and again, you can't use Tearing Jaws at all until they've started to eat at the flesh of humans, right? Because they start at 70. So 70 doesn't, you can't roll a 71 and a success. But as soon as they get like 11 plus wounds that they've inflicted, now they can start inflicting this thing. And so let's come over here and make a new box. Let's call it Red Maw Fever. All right, so you guys have just pulled me into a wonderfully new design space, and I love it. So let me pull up the disease rules. In Jackals. All right, let's go down to the index. There's this wonderful moment in any game design where you realize that the game has grown too big to hold in your head, and that you actually have to go back to the book and reread and remember how things work. And that for me is a wonderful point in the game design process, when the game is too big to just hold in my brain anymore. All right, so here's how we do diseases in Jackals. So we've got Red Maw Fever. The intensity, let's make it intensity 5. So intensity 5 kind of does some things for us. It tells us what the difficulty of the check is. Now let's make it intensity 6. I want this to be scary. No, I got this. Aha. We'll start it off as intensity X. And the damage that it will do is new design being labeled more evil, yes. It will inflict X corruption. All right, so let's finish getting the mechanical stuff in, and then we'll design it. The cycle, so there's poisons and diseases have three components to them in Jackals. They have vector, which my son Zane would immediately start quoting from Despicable Me 1. So the vector here is obviously blood. It enters their bloodstream when they're bitten by the Tearing Jaws attack. It has a cycle, which is how often you make. The cycle is how often you have to make endurance checks. And we're going to say that this is a special cycle, and it will be one time each month. And the intensity is X, where X equals, where it inflicts, it gives you X corruption damage. All right, so let's kind of figure this out. So X equals, why? All right, we'll just say corruption damage. The intensity will equal 1 plus the corruption, or plus 1/2 the corruption of the target. So here's what we're saying here. Essentially, when you contract red moth fever, until you get rid of it, every month you have to make a check, an endurance check. The endurance check and the difficulty of the endurance check is set to half of your personal corruption plus 1. So if it's a 1, if you've been living a good life and you haven't incurred any corruption, congratulations, it's an easy disease to get rid of. If it's not, if you've got corruptive acts, or maybe you've been hit by Savage Rend a couple of times and are sitting at 4 or 5 corruption, now the disease is worse and worse. And so essentially what we're going to say is it inflicts corruption damage per the attribute damage. Corruption damage, well, let's just say equal to 1/2 intensity. No, let's make it as crazy as is. We're play testing this. Equal to attribute damage table. So the attribute damage is less than the physical damage that you take. And what we'll say is, do we tweak this even more? Do we say that, so as you gain corruption, you get twists of the flesh, twists of the mind. And I think I want to make this very specific for these creatures. Instead of rolling for corruption of the mind, target gains the mental trait taste for flesh each time they make a cycle test for the disease. They must also make a willpower check at the same difficulty, or make the following, well, yeah, no. Or, do we just say or? Yeah, I think or must, okay, at the same difficulty. If they fail this check, they must consume human flesh during the next opportunity. This starts the Lukoraji curse. And so what essentially we'll do here, so what we've built with this monster is, the way we've done this is said, all right, if the monster inflicts enough wounds to become a bigger threat, it can infect you with its hunger. It cannot infect you with its curse. But the hunger will continue to gnaw at you, pushing you in a specific direction. If you're able to stave it off for a month and clear your disease, you're great. If not, and you eat human flesh, you now have this Lukoraji curse. And I'm going to work out, before I post it, the stages of the curse. And essentially the idea is if you can resist the cursed and resist giving in multiple times, essentially, before the next aura full moon, so depending on when this happens, or aura new moon, depending on when this happens, you could have days or you could have a whole season to try and stave off this curse. You're fine. If not, yeah, as Becca said, these monster could easily lead a PC to becoming an NPC if the battle goes very wrong. That's a way better way to do this. And this is all comes back to Rook's use of the word infection. Yeah, and it does. It ties back to the original myth. It ties back to. This is a way better design than initially when I was like, oh, we're going to make werewolves in my head. Like, we had the myth. Again, for me, starting with the in-world lore is always the place to start the uh, with the game design. If you don't have the lore figured out, for me at least, and I realize people do this completely different ways in completely different manners, but for me, if I don't have the lore figured out, I don't know how to build a monster. I want to know what their act and their art is in the grounded in the world lore. So this is awesome. This gives us red moth fever. So it's our and I'll put in like kind of what the effects are. I think what we're going to see is that the eyes take on kind of a yellowish cast to them. The lips become even more red and chapped, and the person suffering from the disease is constantly like licking at their lips as if they're over salivating, and it's constantly like raw and cracked. And so that's what we've got here. So we've got the monster that has all of the transgressive consumption themes that we wanted. We have some ties, interesting ties back to the myth and to both the Greek myth of Lukos, as well as some nods to both the Wendigo and to kind of this modern idea that the curse can be passed somehow. And that works fine too. So Becca and Rook were kind of talking back and forth in the chat that Becca builds the lore first and Rook starts with the monster design. And that's great too. There have been times where, especially in like D&D, where I'm like, I really want a monster that does X. How do I work backwards? There's really no wrong way. As long as you're working to like get the two together, I think you're going to end up with a really satisfying monster. So I'm going to get all of this written up, and when it goes live, we'll post it in the show notes on the YouTube export so that you guys can go and use this monster and tell me what you think and give if you end up using it in the game. But I think that this monster fits everything that we wanted to do. Now, next Tuesday, we have one more monster design for Ekiazaru, the Hollow Children, and I think we're going to wait on that. I think I want to start designing the dungeon and get some thoughts out on there and kind of talk with you guys. I'm also planning in April to start a new sub-segment of this show, I guess, which is sort of going to be campaign clinics. So if you guys have questions that you would want to ask me about either my campaigns or even about your campaigns and say, hey, I've got this going on, I'd love to chat about it with the DM. I would love to talk with you guys about your campaigns on stream. I think that would just be spectacular and awesome. So that's our behind the screen for today. Thank you for engaging in this. I will make sure that when I put this up on the blog that I thank everyone in the chat for help with this monster. This monster is way better because of our collaboration, and I really appreciate that. Check out all the other shows on the... Ooh, that's a good point, Rook, that you can wave your hand and say multiverse. I think that's why, for me, Planescape was one of those settings that I liked because it tried to reconcile all of the D&D. It was like the grand unified theory of D&D without adding too much new. I say that knowing that there are 3 monstrous appendices for just the Planescape worlds. Yeah, you can just say multiverse, and then you don't necessarily have to explain where something came from. I wonder if that's why when it came to D&D, back when I got into it, the closed worlds were always the most interesting to me. So like Birthright, which didn't have a lot of ties to the planar, the planar regions. Like it was sort of a closed off world. I know Athos was like that, and to a degree, Kryn was as well. Like they were sort of isolated prime material planes, as opposed to like Faerun or Greyhawk, where they were deeply embedded in the multiversal lore of Dungeons and Dragons. So, if you haven't checked it out, go and check out the Exploring Glorantha episode, which we did on Saturday, which we talked about the Mistali, the dwarves. We did our first live Gumshoe episode for the Iconic podcast on Sunday. I was able to get all of that edited and scheduled, so April's episodes of the Iconic podcast are already waiting to just be downloaded to your phone and listened to. And this Saturday, we have the Grand Campaign episode 3, where we're going to be talking about systems as settings and things that work well with this idea of the multi-generational long-term campaign. I am with you, Padre, for the most part. Once I hit about 3rd edition, that's when kind of Breathen and Tanar came into existence. And I ended up running my own things, although most of my high school and college gaming was actually spent in Rifts, and so we just jumped around the Palladium multiverse. Phase World, Palladium Fantasy, Wormwood was one of my favorite settings. Maybe we should do a Rifts retrospective at one point. Oh, Padre, we need to talk about your Torg game at some point. You got a Torg game set in Isle. That's awesome. Well, thanks to everyone who has joined us. If you like what we do, please consider hitting follow, subscribe, like, whatever buttons happen to be below the screen you are currently watching me on. And if you are not yet a part of it, please consider joining our Patreon over at patreon.com/iconicproduction. You get access to the Discord server. We chat a lot about these things. You get reminders and updates on what we're doing. And we have a wonderful community of people who just love talking about gaming. And that is what I enjoy doing. Hopefully you have picked that up now, 15 or 16 episodes into our behind the screen. I would love to talk about your Torg game in Isle. Yeah, and Isle is definitely the D&D of Torg. And yeah, it's interesting. Sadly, I don't know that this campaign that I'm running on Tuesday nights is going to be going to Isle anytime soon. But tonight we are running the Torg Eternity game on the Ulysses International channel. The as of yet unnamed Storm Knight team has to break into a barracks controlled by Dr. I always want to say Dr. Mobius. I always want to say Dr. Morpheus for some reason. I think I watch too much Venture Brothers. Dr. Mobius is elite shock troopers, so that's going to be a lot of fun to watch. And yeah, so that's it. My coffee is starting to cool off, so I'm going to go finish it off and enjoy it. But thank you to everyone who has joined us this morning, Padre and Rook and Becca and Phantom. It's always good to see all of you. To those of you watching on YouTube, thank you. Please feel free to write a comment. I always respond to the comments. And I will be back on Thursday with more Behind the Screen, where we're going to, I don't know what we're going to talk about on Thursday. I'm going to put it out to the patrons on, maybe I'll do a game review or talk about some books, or maybe talk about Imperium, a new board game that I really love. Padre, that sounds fantastic. A pre-day one Isle invasion. So you're this is when the High Lord first comes to Isle, and the right, this would be with the war with the elves, and man, that sounds fantastic. Yeah, we'll definitely have to chat about that. Oh, and enjoy your game tonight, Rook. Are you GMing or playing in this one tonight? Or yes? All right, well, until next time, everyone, stay safe, stay healthy, stay gaming. I am JM. This is Behind the Screen, and join me on Thursday when we'll once again kind of come around to this side and just have another great discussion. So everyone, thank you so much, and I will see you on Thursday. Have a good one.